then I said, no, I'm the real Lorelai Gilmore. I just can't.
Do you like the comedy, the laughies, or the scaries for reboots?
Oh, the scaries.
For sure.
Absolutely.
Okay.
The scaries.
So you like scary movies?
Yeah.
Okay.
Spookies, ghoulies.
Scary movies? Yeah.
Scary movies, the
Awesome.
worse the better.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any like good like haunted stories or whatever?
No, but...
Well, I've got one.
Oh.
Yeah, but it's not like an old wives' tale or like an urban myth or anything like that. This is actually from like a bookstore that I used to work at back in the Midwest before I moved here.
So this happened to you. This is your...
Yeah, basically. Yeah. I mean, it's like kind of, I don't know, weird or whatever, but yeah, so I was working at this place in the Midwest. I'd been there for a couple of years, was getting acclimated. Things were going pretty well, and I started taking over the responsibilities and duties of our remainders and like our sale books that we would bring in. And it was like a pretty nice little slice of the business. Customers seemed to like it, and it was, it brought in a little extra revenue. It wasn't too frantic or anything, and I just enjoyed it. So I'm doing our sale books, the remainders, and I buy this one book, and I thought, at first glance, I thought it would be as good as any of the other ones, pillar of 20th century modernist literature, translated, good, clean copies, there's nothing wrong with it. So I put it out, and it takes like months for it to eventually sell down, right? It was just a really long time. And so finally, the copies are starting to move and everything. But then there's still just this one remainder that's still on the table. And it just sits there for weeks and weeks and weeks. And it seemed like there was no way for me to like artfully pair it or merchandise it that it'll jump. And then finally, on my restock report, it looked like it sold. And then when I go to the table to look, it was still there. Even though it said in our inventory we weren't supposed to have any, the book was still there. So I was like, that's kind of weird. I really thought it sold. So then I pick it up, I take it, and I make it a bargain, which I didn't want to do.
Makes sense.
Yeah. I don't like doing that, but, I was like, what choice did I have? I had to do what I had to do. So I make it a bargain book, and I put it in the bargain bin, and I don't even like go over there for, several days, maybe a week. And I figure eventually somebody will pick it up at a bargain price and just take it. And then eventually, when I went back after about a week, it wasn't there anymore. So I was like, okay. And I felt relieved because I was like, at least I won't get this remainder anymore. So it seemed like it was gone, like somebody had bought it, and I thought that was it. But then when I went downstairs into the bargain overstock, it was there, just like leering at me, basically. I felt it in a way. Couldn't really explain it, but I picked it up and I took it out, threw it into recycling, which again I didn't want to do. I mean, nobody likes to recycle books, but I just needed to get rid of it. So I threw it in recycling, and I thought that was that, until it showed up in my mailbox in my home address. Like there was just no way that it could have ended up there, right? I couldn't explain it. So that very same day, I took it out of my mailbox and I drove down to the river and I threw it into the dam and I watched it fall into the river. And I thought that was that. I just didn't know that the very next day when I went back into the store, it would be right there on the shelf, still. Dry as a bone, like nothing had ever happened. So that day, I finally resolved that this would be it. So I took it. Right after work, I took it, and I drove to the nearest Salvation Army, and I just gave it to them. And all I said was, you have to get rid of this. Make sure it does not leave your property until somebody buys it and you see it leave. You have to get rid of it. And then I drove away. And it was only later, like a week later, that I found out that same Salvation Army burned to the ground. Now, I have no idea what happened to that book, but I never saw it again. But still, I couldn't shake this feeling whenever I was working there. I just felt like I was constantly being watched. Like, no matter where I was or what I was doing, something was looking at me. And I started having these dreams of like this red eye constantly following me. And it wasn't like a bright red either. It was like sickly and faded, like a scab that wouldn't go away. I never felt comfortable again in that store. It wasn't too long after that that I quit.
But that's just a story, right?
God damn it. Not again. Hello, hi there, I'm Matt.
And I'm Jacob.
And together we make up Unprotected Texts. Now we here at Unprotected Texts LLC are aware of things that are happening on the Netflix, the flicks of the net. There is a recent adaptation called The Haunting of Bly Manor that has received somewhat acclaim recently. And we posit humbly that many of the people who are watching The Haunting of Bly Manor are those who like to think of themselves as bookish, but haven't picked up a book in probably about 3 years or so. But when hearing that The Haunting of Bly Manor is inspired by The Turn of the Screw by Henry James, they think, I like books, I read, I can read. They think, I'll just watch this and this will count as basically a book. But we here at Unprotected Texts LLC, we want to encourage you resolutely. We bear good tidings of great joy in that this book is less than 100 pages, so you can actually get through it in a weekend. So we just wanted to put this out there and as a intro and a feeler and a visual audio guide introduction to the wonderful novel by Henry James, The Turn of the Screw. Well, it's a spooky story.
It is
because we are in spooky season. But if you're an organist, every season is spooky season. It's basically a frame story. So you start out the prologue with these people like telling each other stories around a fire on Christmas Eve, as you do in England.
very classic.
Tradition to tell ghost stories on Christmas Eve that is sort of fallen by the wayside, I think.
Bring it back.
The story within the story is basically this young woman who's about 20-ish.
Yeah.
She answers an advertisement of this rich, well-off gentleman in London who needs a governess to take care of his orphaned niece and nephew, and so she goes to this this estate, which is purportedly in Bly, England, and weird stuff starts happening. And initially, the kids, it's like a little boy and a little girl that she's tasked with taking care of. Initially, she's just completely enraptured by how good they are and how pretty and beautiful the kids are, which. Take it or leave it. She starts seeing two other people around the house and on the property, and she thinks that these apparitions of the former governess, her predecessor, and the valet, who have both died, she thinks that their spirits are trying to corrupt and capture the children.
Yeah. One fact I did learn about this book that I absolutely kind of am really jealous of the people at the time. They got it started out as a serialized.
Sure.
It was like 12 installments in like
Yes.
a periodical, which that feels like such a fun way to read this book.
Yeah, most of Dickens was that way, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was, and actually most of the rest of Henry James as well was released that way. Portrait of a Lady was released that way, and that one's long.
I'm also thinking that was maybe a marketing ploy on the part of the publishing houses. If after serializing a story, it turns out that it's a bomb and a big old turd, then they're like, we're not publishing this. We're not going to put this in a book form. No one wanted to read it before. They're not going to read it now.
Absolutely. And at least they didn't have the comics thing with a bunch of variant covers. There weren't like retread editions of Turn of the Screw, although there were quite a few editions of Turn of the Screw.
Yes.
Even in his time.
Yes, about 4, I believe.
Yeah.
Before his own death.
Yeah.
At the hands of a little boy, curiously enough.
Foreshadowing.
That little boy, Adolf Hitler.
Okay, I guess, Matt, should we just get into
No.
Oh, no?
I'm not talking, you're talking. Because I have a question for you. So other than the obvious fact that we are knee-deep in spooky season, was there a particular impetus or reason that you wanted to get into this particular book right here? Because I'll just say real quick, I had read this before. I'd read this about a year and a half before.
Oh, that recently.
Yeah, pretty recent. So I was familiar with a lot of the major plot points and the beats and the characters, but I still reread the whole thing. From this edition we got here, but it was one that I've read before and you hadn't ever read. So why now and why this one?
Because I heard it was a very seminal ghost story and a very classic spooky tale that I'd never really gotten around to. And I do love, be it a movie or a book or whatever, or just a drawing on a sidewalk, if it's spooky and it's got a skull in it or some ghosts or some violent, I'm on board. I'll at least check it out. I delighted in reading it, honestly. Okay. I thought it was expertly done. My favorite twisted, what's unreliable narrator, what's real, it's up to you, the reader, you decide. Vote now for your favorite color of M&M.
What we're gonna put in that M&M.
And what we're gonna put in that M&M, and it's
Ghost and Children's Blood.
I love his sentences.
Oh!
His sentences.
The last sentence is fucking awesome. Like the last little bit.
It's a great closer.
Just
all of them. All of the prepositional phrases that he's able to weave together. Every now and then I stumble over one, but I think that's my modern sensibility and
for sure.
Because otherwise, they're long sentences, but they're beautifully constructed and they flow forward and they really come together like that.
It's a Snuggie of death. You first see it and you're like, how the fuck does this work? This is stupid as hell. And you put it on and you go, oh wait, oh my art, oh, this is cozy. Oh, and then you just stay there till you die.
Depression now.
It's got creepy children who you're not sure whose side they're on. And it's got kind of a final girl a little bit. To borrow a trope from Men, Women, and Chainsaws. It's got kind of a final girl. It really lays a lot of groundwork for obviously many things have come after it that were clearly inspired by it.
Right, and this was published in 1898, just for context, so just on the cusp of the 20th century and all of the horrors that modernist literature would unleash on us.
So, Matt, you read this before. I didn't realize how recently.
Yes, quite recently.
Any new insights? How did you feel this time, that time?
Well, I will say that before, the particular edition that I had read was the Penguin Random House edition from Penguin Putnam. The classic black cover and everything. It was like $6 or something.
Perfect
and
price.
The second time around, I think when I started reading it again, I had realized that I had sort of forgotten or blanked out of my memory like the latter half of what was happening. So some of the, I knew how it ended, but some of the things I forgot how we got to that ending. So being reminded of some of the the psychological tableaus and a couple of the spook sightings I had forgotten about as well. The second time around, I definitely was able to pick up more on the whole is it or isn't it conceit of is it all made up.
Yeah.
Spoilers, by the way, in case you've been under a rock for the last century. But I mean, I didn't know. Something that I picked up on was how when Miles, the little boy, is named Miles, the little girl is named Flora. They're like 10 and 7, respectively. Something I picked up on when Miles starts asking when he's going to be able to go back to school. And because the reason that's one of the beats that you find out about is he was sent back from his boarding school to the country estate for some reason, and he was dismissed
and he
for some reason.
Doesn't talk about it. You don't find out.
It's never fully disclosed.
Fully disclosed, yeah.
But he's like starting to ask, when can I go back to school? When can I be with my classmates? I want to see the world. I want to have life experiences. I really read into that a lot of pubescent sort of masculine assertion against domestic life, basically, because he is at that point. He's about to cross over onto the other side.
Cross over to the other side.
When do boys become men?
Right.
What sets it off? Is it, inherent in everybody all the time?
Yeah.
Or is it just like a case-by-case basis and based on their upbringing?
Yeah.
Nature versus nurture for gender and sexuality, because you also do sort of feel that eventually he's going to start, developing interests in women. And I mean, he's only around like his governess, his sister, the housemaid, Mrs. Gross.
Yeah. And
it can be viewed, based on the evidence and based on the description of the estate, it can be viewed as a very repressive environment.
James writing about that transitional period, because, and the other, I'm basing this on the other book I read of his, Portrait of a Lady, which is all about growing up into a society that you then find yourself trapped in. Even if you have the best of luck, sometimes everything just kind of works its way to build a cage around you in some fashion.
Like Rose.
Yes.
In Titanic.
Exactly. And then her cage was the other. So I think that is definitely something that James always thought about and probably had on the forefront of his mind, especially with how much of like high society or like upper crust writing and things he wrote about. I could totally see that being the case of it being very intentionally this boy's like coming of age story. We should mention the governess is technically the main character. I would argue that it's technically more the kid's story.
Because her focus is on them.
Yeah.
Almost
entirely. Did you think she had much of a characterization or
in terms of like what the question of whether or not she's mentally unstable?
Not even that. I'm talking like bare bones, like characterization. Like, does she pass the Turing test version of characterization?
I mean, we know the backstory is that she's a parson's daughter.
Yeah.
Also from the country like herself, not very well off, but also not destitute.
Yeah.
And but still has to work. We know that she becomes infatuated with the children's uncle when she goes to answer for the advertisement for a governess. So we know that she has feelings and is...
She does things to affect the plot. In a way, but it's a lot of things. But most of the book, I would argue, is things happening to her and her reacting. So I don't know. I think for me, the focus is really on the kids.
But even those reactions are not really much of anything. Like at one point, she does finally resolve upon herself to write to the uncle.
Yeah.
And by the way, the uncle told her to basically fuck off.
Yeah.
And he was like, "Don't contact me."
He's like, "Seriously, I don't even know these kids. I don't even know what tiny people are. Just get them out of here."
She finally resolves after like several freaky stuff happens. She finally resolves to write to him, but then she doesn't.
Yeah. Which plays into, I think, That we can talk about if we want to. We want to. Okay, here's a burpee. Beep, 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 cut. How far do we want to drill down on this unreliable narrator
Drill,
stuff?
baby, drill.
Drill, baby, drill. Okay, 2008. Here we come.
I think whether or not you believe that she's mentally unstable and is just imagining and hallucinating these ghosts, or whether they are actually there in some form or another, even though quite concretely she is the only person that sees them. Objectively, okay, fine. Objective. I think that you're meant to get the sense that there are a couple of screws loose. Like if she were on the witness stand and if I were in the jury,
Right.
I would kind of like look at her sideways. Do you know what I mean?
Sure. Yeah, no, she definitely gives off that appearance of someone who buys crystals.
But I do, however, have a problem with some of the Freudian psychoanalytic interpretations. Because it has more than a little whiff of the old sexism.
I'm grabbing the wheel. You're pointing like, oh, look, let's stop at the rock caverns. Like, fuck yeah, let's stop at those deep, dank caverns of psychoanalytic Freudian bullshit.
Oh Lord, it was Edna something and Harold Goddard who were pushing the pre-Freudian psychoanalytic bent and interpretation, which is basically to say that everything that she's hallucinating is because she's in love with the uncle, and her ovaries made her do it.
I don't even want to pretend to be like give him a fair shake, honestly, because it's so... we see it all the time, too. We even see it, not even like in metaphor, we see it very literally. Like, I mean, my God, how many times does James Bond, like, walk up to a woman and go, hi, penis, 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 and she goes, ah! You know, so it's a bad stereotype, and it's been going on for like 100 years plus now, at least in my edition. There was also counterpoints to almost every essay.
Yes, in the essay that I just read most recently by Robert Heilman, there's pushback on that very succinctly and smartly, I think, saying that the seed and the germination of the plot is not in her repressed feelings for the uncle and her attraction for him that sets off all the hallucinations, but rather her feeling of attachment to him is just a plot contrivance and a structure that explains why she feels uncomfortable writing to him later in the story when things are going bad.
Absolutely.
It's just a case that she wants to feel like, you know, she's done a good job and not let him down. And it explains that part of why she won't bring him in on this and write to him. Yeah. Which, because to me, I mean, if it were me, the very first time, I would have been like, I'm out of here. I'll see you later.
I do actually have kind of a problem with, not a huge problem to be clear, with the governess being this kind of background character. I think it works in some ways. We're giving us this really, like, helps with the vagary, helps with like the illusion he wants to cast and really wants to get thinking about what her real mental state is. But in other ways, it gives her kind of this lack of characterization where we can fit these kind of like plot, what do you call them, contrivances?
It's not a whole. It's like when you're looking at...
I can't wait for this.
It's like... If you were to look at a house, right? It's like a pretty new house that was just finished. Yeah. Like just down the street. Yeah. And you're thinking that everything looks pretty cool, and then suddenly you notice that there's like this big iron beam sort of sticking out the side, and you're like...
It's not that classic case of like a male author who doesn't know how to write a woman. Because Portrait of a Lady is very well layered and very...
He was gay, wasn't he?
I don't know for sure.
I thought he did like have a documented like affairs though.
It's possible. I mean, really don't know.
He wasn't like wilding out with Nick Cannon like Oscar Wilde was.
Sure.
He wasn't like, you know, swinging from a pole on Bond Street in Soho or anything.
But if only.
One day.
I am like so sick of that trope though of
potentially gay authors.
Potentially gay authors, like, but because that always where the conversation ends with every one of their books. It's like Portrait of a Lady. So Henry James wrote this very well laid woman because he was a homosexual.
But I mean, gays can write women terribly too.
That's what I'm saying. But that's like that's where the critics come in.
Okay.
And they're like, well, he was clearly a gay because he wrote this woman so well. You know, because like real men can't write women because they got lady bits and I have man bits. A lot of that got pushed on Henry James. No matter his sexuality.
Okay.
He wrote an introduction for the 1908
1905
edition of the book, where he kind of lays it out pretty plainly. He's like, it's a fairy tale, it's a spooky one, and I wanted you guys to really have fun with it.
The early criticisms and the early commentary on it, like Virginia Woolf and the others, picked up on that.
Yeah.
It's also funny, I don't know if this was in your edition, but in my edition, which is the Norton Critical Edition, available wherever books are sold. But probably not. So they're more expensive, but they have more commentary and criticism. So if you're a grad student in Comp Lit, then this is more your scene. And it just presents more material to chew on.
Between the two, there's a lot of like reviews and criticisms, essays and think pieces, and even...
Think pieces on think pieces.
Think pieces on
Analyses
think pieces.
of the think pieces of the think pieces.
Exactly. It's just layers and layers and layers of critical theory.
I love academia sometimes.
I hate it. I hate it. It makes me want to...
Sometimes.
Really...
We're not in it, Sis.
That's true.
We're not in it.
We can stand out here like...
We watch the car crashes, but we're not in it. Were there any criticisms that you liked, that you read from your book, or did it all frustrate you?
Okay, here's the thing. I'm not great at, like... Theory. I don't have a mind for it. With this particular book, the criticism kind of annoyed me more than usual because there is so, like, it's intentionally vague. And part of that is, yes, to inspire conversation, but also when you're, like, trying to drill down and be like, this is this way. No. Like, categorically no for this particular work, in my opinion. It's meant to be unpin-downable.
Another drop in the bucket of academia. And academia is a bucket.
It's a bucket.
A chicken bucket.
It's
a chicken bucket.
$5 KFC. So we got these two editions, like we said, both retail for about $20. What do you think, Matt? Worth the price of admission?
For Norton, yeah, I would say yes. And I mean, Norton does put out a lot of critical editions across American, English, Continental, Russian. I don't think they do a lot of world literature like East Asian or South American. That's, I think, something they can work on. They do like re-release updated editions, and I think even Turn of the Screw is going to have a third edition of the Norton Critical, I think in November.
Okay,
which is stupid of them. They should have done it.
They should have done it.
Hello? Hello? Anybody home? Hey, think McFly.
I would say when you're weighing critical editions, I would say the same thing that I say to people who are weighing different translations, which is to just literally open her up and try it out.
Yeah.
Which, incidentally enough, is not something you can do on Amazon. So this warrants going to a physical bookstore.
Absolutely. Or asking a bookseller who may have done some experiments with critical editions.
Yes.
I think also, too, it depends on what you're doing with it.
Yeah.
Because, okay, I would never, ever, 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 never, ever buy a critical edition of
any book ever.
And here's why. Because I just
You don't like being told what to think.
I don't like being told what to think. I don't even like watching trailers.
But what about if not if not like essays or criticism, what about footnotes?
Okay, well,
would you like weigh the footnotes / endnotes situation?
It is important. I should say critical editions of novels or fiction.
Okay.
Particularly because I don't like watch trailers. I don't even really read introductions until I finish the book, if at all.
Well, I only do that because I don't want to get spoiled. Sometimes I've noticed every now and then, like PRH has gotten better about in the introduction. It'll say like, oh, this introduction includes major plot beats and events that happen. So skip the introduction if that's your concern.
Yeah.
So that's why I usually do that but it's not like I'm worried about tainting my experience of the reading of it.
See, that's what I'm worried about, though. You know, movies, TV, any media, really. I like to experience it in the moment, in my face, just dunk my head in, and then see what I think. that's not to say that my opinion, once I'm done, like once I close the book, I'm like, done for the first time. Not to say that my opinion's locked and that I won't do further research. Like I will never look back. And I love like doing research online, especially about authors I love or like things like that. Like I love just clicking on rabbit holes and stuff. And that's kind of why, not to like malign a print form, not to malign a form of media that we're currently trying to hawk, but print is dead. Most of the criticisms in this particular edition, the Bedford St. Martins
Of Macmillan fame.
You can find online, and they're free, and they're out there.
HarperCollins should get on the game. They should release their own edition.
Oh God!
Of Turn of the Screw.
Yeah,
if
except
the Christians will let them.
And footnotes are important, especially in books, and this is actually a thing I want to do, because this is why this edition...
This is why you do not recommend your edition.
This is why I really don't recommend that edition. So this is how the text is laid out, and I'm just going to read this in real time, just to give you an idea of if you were to read the story, and then stop at every footnote and go read that footnote, then go back to the story. This is how it would sound. The Turn of the Screw. Footnote. The Turn of the Screw, in the original Collier's Weekly publication, The Turn of the Screw, was divided into 5 parts, with 12 installments, in addition to the prologue and 24 Roman numeral pace of the periodical version. These notes indicate where the 5 parts and 12 installments began. End of footnote. The story. Footnote. Story. This term refers to a tale told by Griffin, one of the men gathered around the fire. The story has been about this was the ghost of a boy, a little boy, and his mother. Had held us round the fire, sufficiently breathless, but except for the obvious remark that it was gruesome, as on Christmas Eve, in an old house, a strange tale should essentially be. I remember no comment uttered till somebody happened to note it as the only case. Case! The term case, you get my point. That was one sentence.
It's too much.
If you're like a grad student and this is part of like a broader like the project you're working on, it is probably important to have like a nice collection of all these criticisms and references to go through. But as a reader, it's a nightmare. It's a drag. I just want to read the story, man. I read it all.
I'm happy.
I just don't know why. The story was in a story. I'm reading a story. You don't have to define story. Don't buy this edition.
But consider Norton.
So I was curious as to why this one received so much attention. And before I dump my theory, I want to hear if you have any.
Well, I think it's multifaceted. There are several sections and possible reasons behind that. I think some of that has to do with the fact that this came towards the later stage of James's career.
Yeah.
One of the reviews that came down positively, it was either the Times or the New York Tribune, saying that basically if Henry James had written this earlier in his career, he would have been an assured success and would have achieved legendary status even earlier. Whereas I think the inverse, which is that he could have only written this at this junction in his career. When you read chronologically a lot of the criticisms and hot takes of the book throughout the decades and as they go on.
Yeah.
So like I said, Virginia Woolf and a lot of other people from the first decade of the 20th century, they basically stayed along the track that Henry James laid out in his preface.
Yeah.
And going with those terms. As history progresses and World War I happens, Sigmund Freud happens, interpretation...
Which is worse, you decide.
Call it. The post-World War I hot intellectual frothiness that's coming out of Vienna, the continent, and spilling over into London and New York. I think just the time that it came out and how quickly things progressed within just like a decade and a half after the story came out and all of the intellectual progress and historical tragedies that happened right after that, it was sort of ripe to be still in the air, whereas if this had been written 2 decades previous, it probably wouldn't have still been around people's consciousness or on their radar.
Yeah.
Did you think anything similar along?
Well, this is what I was thinking.
Why the dog pile? The intellectual dog pile?
Well, I thought about it because what really stuck with me, one, I could not help but think about, like, if this were written today and, like, the same reaction was applied to this, it would just be, like, YouTube videos of like 12 things you missed in Turn of the Screw.
Yeah,
like,
Easter eggs.
like with like the stupid like circling nothing in
Yeah.
with the background, being like, you missed this, you
Yeah.
idiots.
It's about Willy Wonka.
I finally think I found the horror movie to compare it to.
Okay.
I think it's kind of like the Blair Witch Project. I should mention this is a ghost story in genre fiction, but it is a lot more prevalent to the time it was written because seances were big. Ghost stories were ghosts
And it's a different
and
type of
hauntings.
ghost story.
Exactly.
It's not a romance.
No.
Like, it's not a romance like Women in White or The Mysteries
Oh
of
yeah,
Udolpho.
yeah, the Wilkie Collins. Yeah.
What James uses to create the effect of the horror is the mundane.
So that's why I think it's kind of like the Blair Witch Project, and why to this day the Blair Witch Project gets so picked over. One, it basically invented a genre.
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
found footage.
Found footage, or launched it. I mean, yes, there were probably things before it. I'm not gonna say. Never mind.
What?
I could just already hear the. But actually, because I forget the name of the movie, and I'm gonna put it in here because that movie was actually the first found footage movie, but no one fucking saw it. I already know that fun fact. All right, I already know that fun fact. It played with ambiguity. It was a totally different type of horror than we were used to seeing.
Mm-hmm.
The horror movies we saw where kids go into woods, where kids go into the woods, they fuck, they get murdered by monsters.
Mm-hmm.
Not in Blair Witch. Kids go into the woods, they don't really, there's no boobies everywhere, and then they just hear noises, and then something happens. Really opened up a lot of doors for a lot of people who probably read it. Like, imagine like you're an aspiring author and you're reading this in a periodical, week by week, and the story's unfolding before you, and you're like waiting for this like tense conclusion, but then you get the conclusion, and then you're like, wait, what
Was it or wasn't it?
was it or wasn't it? And so then you're thinking about it forever, and you talk about it with your friends, and then it goes on from there. Same thing happened with Parasite recently. I mean, that's already.
Don't ruin it for me. I saw.
How much time you got tonight? And I'm not going to say all the criticism is definitely necessary, because it's
Right.
definitely not. But I think after a little contemplation, I can see why we have like two different super heavy duty editions for grad students, you know, out in the world. That was rambly, but
Archibald.
Paranormal Activity.
Or maybe we should call him Franz Ferdinand.
That is the exact pose he died in.
His wife was smoking a cigarette.
Absolutely. She probably was, though. Their car was broke down, so they weren't
Yeah.
like doing a lot.
She's like, again.
Again, first the grenade, now this.
Thank you for watching and for tuning in and coming along on this ghost-tacular ride into this story novel by Henry James. We highly recommend it wherever, whatever edition you go with, and take part in the lively conversation of whether this governess is cracked in the head or not.
Yeah! If you would like to follow us on the social medias and watch us get up to some real spooky stuff 24/7, 7 days a week,
There's nothing spookier
365
than
days
Twitter.
a year. Ha ha!
The bird app is very spooky. Speaking of the birds,
The birds is a
Twitter. That's spooky.
If you want to follow us on those, you can do so at unprotected.texts on Instagram.
And on Twitter at unprotectedtext.
Yes. And for all of the podcast versions, and to clarify, I feel like I haven't said this recently.
Podcast versions.
Podcast! For the podcast versions, we cut down on, of course, the visual elements that we're throwing in here, and just do kind of little longer format rants and longer tangents. Less quickly cut. We kind of let ourselves ramble. So yeah, check
And it's
those
all
out.
on Libsyn.
It's all on Libsyn.
Libsyn.
YN. And if you know how to get onto Spotify, please tell us, because I am at the end of my rope. So thank you for watching, and until next time, if you're gonna run from yourself,
At least bring a book.
Ooh.